Welcome to Captains of Industry, the Second Industrial Revolution,
an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you.
By the end of this tutorial, you will understand some of the differences between the First and Second Industrial Revolutions and key developments that drove the Second Industrial Revolution. You will also learn about some of the leaders of industry during this era. Often, these men were called the captains or masters of industry. You may have heard of names like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. We'll take a look at the lives of these men, as well as a few others, and examine how their development of major industries and business practices affected America's economy during the Second Industrial Revolution. Let's begin by examining the differences between the First and Second Industrial Revolutions. The First Industrial Revolution began in England in 1760. It spread to Europe and then made its way across the Atlantic to the United States around 1790. During the First Industrial Revolution, textiles was the dominant industry. Textiles are fabric or cloth materials often produced by weaving. The textile industry deals with the making of fabric, including fabric used for clothing. New technologies like the power loom and cotton gin enabled workers to increase the production of cotton, allowing the textile industry to flourish. The modern mechanical cotton gin was invented in 1793 by an American, Eli Whitney. American factories were largely powered by water power during this era, with use of steam power still in its early stages. What is now called the factory system was developed during this time. This system allowed work to be performed on a large scale in one centralized location. Textile mills that used this system sprang up across New England. Businessman Francis Lowell expanded upon this idea by creating an innovative labor program where young women not only worked at the textile factory or mill, but also lived in company housing and were provided with educational and cultural opportunities. His workers came to be known as the Lowell Girls. As the number of factories rose, many workers left agricultural work and moved to cities to work in factories. A number of elements allowed factories and industries to expand, including the production of new chemicals, the availability of cheaper iron and steel, and the development of tools that allowed metal to be cut easily and accurately by machine tools instead of by hand. This increased the use of metal in all kinds of machinery, enlarged the use of machines in factories, and made it possible to build larger and more powerful engines that further enhanced industry. Gas lighting was also developed, and this allowed factories and stores to remain open longer. Nightlife in cities and towns grew because streets could be lit on a large scale. There were also advancements in transportation with the use of steamboats, steamships, the steam locomotive, and development of railways. Communication across long distances became easier with the introduction of the telegraph. This device transmitted electric signals over a wire laid between stations. Samuel Morse developed a code, now known as Morse code, that assigned a set of dots and dashes to each letter of the alphabet. This allowed complex messages to be relayed simply and easily across telegraph lines. In 1844, Morse sent his first public telegraph message from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Maryland. The message said, "What hath God wrought?" The Second Industrial Revolution is typically dated from about 1870 to 1914, ending with the start of World War I. Unlike the First Industrial Revolution, where America lagged many years behind other nations in becoming a part of the movement, America was at the heart of the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution is also known as the Technological Revolution. This era saw the widespread use of the internal combustion engine and machinery in manufacturing. Inventors and business owners developed more efficient, labor-saving machinery and mass production techniques, including the use of the assembly line that spurred advances in productivity and efficiency. Countless inventions were also produced to make the everyday lives of Americans easier. Sewing machines, typewriters, the fountain pen, the first modern air conditioner, safety pins and paper clips, adding machines, cash registers, and the escalator, to name just a few. During this era, the national telegraph networks were completed, enhancing communication across the country. Another revolutionary invention that forever changed how people communicated was Alexander Graham Bell's creation of the telephone in 1876. In the early days, his invention was often called a speaking telegraph. In the 20 years that followed his invention, America would have over 6 million telephones. The use of electricity also began in this era with Thomas Edison's first commercially viable incandescent light bulb, which he called an electric lamp, invented in 1879. The widespread use of electrical power accelerated the pace of industrial change, created dramatic advances in the power and efficiency of machinery, enhanced the production of steel and chemicals, and spurred the growth of cities. In addition, America during the Second Industrial Revolution became a manufacturing powerhouse. In 1894, America displaced Britain as the world's leading manufacturer. By 1914, it was the world's leading producer of coal, natural gas, oil, copper, iron ore, and silver. Its factories were producing more goods than Britain, Germany, and France combined. With the increase in steel production during this era, railway networks began to crisscross the nation, eventually connecting the east and west coasts. The completion of these networks helped grow American industry as goods could be transported more quickly and easily across the country. And finally, new entities called corporations were developed. A corporation is a business organization owned by a group of stockholders. In this era, many businesses grew into large firms that controlled all aspects of production and distribution, and others grew by mergers, joining forces with their competitors to dominate industries. Huge corporations led by the captains of industry helped grow the American economy. During the Second Industrial Revolution, American author Mark Twain coined the term the Gilded Age as a way to describe the widespread political corruption and corporate greed that characterized much of this era. Historians typically date the Gilded Age from 1865 to roughly the end of the 19th century. Firmly enmeshed in the political corruption and corporate greed of the Gilded Age were the captains of industry, sometimes called robber barons. This negative term was often applied to powerful businessmen in this era who used exploitative practices to amass tremendous wealth. They crisscrossed the continent with railroads, built factories, formed corporations, spurred the growth of cities, accumulated great personal wealth, and adorned cities and countrysides with their mansions. Between 1840 and 1915 alone, the number of millionaires in America went from 20 to 40,000. These innovative, bold, shrewd, but often ruthless and dishonest businessmen used their leadership, money, and power to transform America. Their accomplishments were a crucial factor in spurring a huge economic transformation across America. During the latter half of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, America enjoyed a period of economic growth unlike any seen anywhere in history. Another important factor in this economic boom was that the American government did not regulate or control the activities of big business or provide oversight of business operations or working conditions. This allowed the captains of industry to pursue their work with few restrictions on their behavior. This allowed them to make tremendous money, but often at the expense of the laborers who worked underneath them. John D. Rockefeller, a captain of industry during the Gilded Age, strove to bring order to the chaotic oil industry. At the time, oil could be refined into kerosene, which was used in lighting, heating, and cooking. Thus, the economic importance of oil was tremendous, and the potential profits that could be made from it were huge. The company he formed was called the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. Standard Oil quickly became the largest oil refiner, but Rockefeller wanted to eliminate his competitors in order to raise the price of oil and increase profits. Through an economic practice called horizontal integration, one company buys out, takes over, or merges with other companies in the same industry, and they are all absorbed into one big company. Through horizontal integration, by 1879, Standard Oil bought out most of its competitors and controlled over 90% of the oil refining in the United States. Standard Oil would go on to become one of the world's first and largest multinational corporations, and with it, Rockefeller would become one of the richest men in the world. Much of Standard Oil's success was based on Rockefeller's desire to cut costs and eliminate wasteful or unnecessary spending. Standard Oil practiced what economists call vertical integration. With vertical integration, one company owns everything in its supply chain. This meant that Standard Oil produced, controlled, or owned everything it needed to operate and did not have to rely on the products or services of other businesses. It produced its own oil and barrels, owned most of the pipelines leading to the railroads, owned the railroad tank cars the oil was transported in, and even owned the oil storage facilities. To consolidate their scattered business interests under more efficient control, in 1882, Rockefeller and his advisors organized all their companies under one corporate trust called the Standard Oil Trust. A trust is a combination of firms or corporations for the purpose of reducing competition and controlling prices throughout a business or industry. All 37 stockholders in various Standard Oil enterprises transferred their stock to 9 trustees and received trust certificates in return, which paid them annual dividends from the company's earnings. The 9 trustees, which included Rockefeller, controlled 41 companies within the Standard Oil Trust. However, critics argued that Standard Oil Trust was a monopoly. A monopoly is having complete ownership or control of the entire supply of goods or a service in a certain market. This is contrary to the practice of free enterprise where businesses compete for profit. Critics further argued Standard Oil not only consolidated control over the oil industry, but crushed its competitors, leveraged its huge resources to create an uneven playing field, and even wielded its money and power to influence politics. In 1892, the Ohio Supreme Court ordered the Standard Oil Trust dissolved. In a few short years, what was formerly the Standard Oil Trust was legally reborn in 1899 as a holding company. A holding company is a corporation that owns enough voting stock in one or more companies to exercise control over them. As a holding company, Standard Oil held stock in 41 other companies, and these companies controlled even more companies. Despite its rebirth as a holding company, critics argued that Standard Oil was still a monopoly and a trust, and in 1911 the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil had to be dismantled. It was split into 34 individual companies, 2 of which eventually became Exxon and Mobil. Ironically, the breakup of Standard Oil enabled Rockefeller and his associates to amass even more wealth. At the time of the breakup, Rockefeller held 25% of Standard Oil stock, and he and his stockholders received shares of the 34 individual companies. Rockefeller, a controversial giant of American business in the Gilded Age, played a key role in helping transform and grow the American economy. Both loved and hated during his 98-year lifetime, he practiced philanthropy and gave away more than $500 million, much of it to support education and healthcare. Andrew Carnegie was a captain of industry who led the expansion of the steel industry. After the invention of the Bessemer converter in 1855, iron could be turned into steel quickly and cheaply, and as a result, the use for steel soared. Steel was used to build large bridges, railroads, skyscrapers, large ships, and steel cables, rods, and sheets which allowed for even larger engines to be built for industry use. Carnegie adapted the Bessemer process for mass-producing steel and established the first steel mills in the United States. In 1892, he combined his many assets into the Carnegie Steel Company. Like Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, the Carnegie Steel Company was a vertically integrated company. Carnegie Steel controlled where the steel was made, where that iron ore was extracted, and owned or controlled the coal mines that supplied the coal, the ships that transported the iron ore, and the railroads that transported the coal to the factory. Over time, Carnegie's holdings grew into a steel empire. By 1900, Carnegie Steel Company produced more steel than all of Great Britain. In 1901, Carnegie was ready to retire and he sold his steel business to J.P. Morgan for $480 million. Upon finalizing the deal, J.P. Morgan told Carnegie, "Congratulations, Mr. Carnegie, you are now the richest man in the world." Carnegie spent the remainder of his life as a philanthropist, giving away $350 million, as he said, to improve mankind. He donated money to universities and hospitals, built libraries, parks, meeting halls, and churches. Like other captains of industry, Carnegie was a controversial figure.